It's really good to have this opportunity to share with you some thoughts about the gut microbiome, about how it impacts our bodies and what impacts that positively and negatively. So before we start, I'd just like to ask you to turn off your mobile phones and have a quick scan over the evaluation form that I've got sitting beside you. I would invite you to fill that out at the end of this presentation. It will help improve my presentation skills. So thank you. I would also like to invite you to keep an open mind and a critical mind on the information that's presented here today. So one of the things we want to talk about is the gut microbiome. But what is the gut microbiome? So our bodies are full of over 100 trillion bacteria. They outnumber our gene pool by 1 to 10. So we are literally mainly made up of bacteria. We are a walking, talking community. But how does that happen? So when we're born, just before we're born, our bodies are sterile. We have no bugs in us. And when we're born, we come through the birth canal and we have our first exposure to bacteria. Our second exposure to bacteria is when we're held. So we get bacteria from the skin from other people. And once upon a time, and certainly when I was nursing, it seemed really, really important to put the baby on the mother's chest and to be able to have that skin contact. And we thought very much along the lines of the necessity and importance for attachment. But now this growing body of evidence for surrounding bacteria and how important that is in the role in our health, we're starting to think a little bit along the lines of it. It's really important for them to share bacteria in that moment. Some of the things that happen once we're born and we have that skin contact is we're breastfed. And one of the things that comes through breastfeeding is the prebiotics with the breast milk. And that also helps to populate our gut flora. So we're getting this community growing. By the time we're 3, that community is actually as established as it will be as an adult. And interesting studies about that with regards to children who are born by cesarean section. So a man wrote a book about the diet myth, and he has done Proctor has done many, Spector actually, I can't remember his name. Anyway, many studies done on twins. And there were 2 twins, and one of them was sort of fat and miserable, and one was thin and quite happy. No, that's not a nice way to talk about people, but anyway, that's how they were. And he was able to trace that back right to the bacteria that was exchanged between the nurses at birth. So that's a very interesting thought, isn't it? That bacteria we take on, so we might take up on the genetics of that. The makeup of that. That's genetics, it's probably not the right word. So what happens next is we start to eat. I want to just sort of look at our digestive system and just have a quick reminder about how it works when it works well. The moment we start thinking about food, our body starts to create saliva in our mouths, and we start to eat. It breaks the enzymes break it down. It comes down. It starts to go through the esophagus. It starts going around the stomach, and all these enzymes and acids are breaking the food down. It goes into our gut. It goes through I consider this all to be the gastrointestinal tract. So through the gut into the small and large intestines, and eventually, once it's given our body what it needs, it comes out as poop. But what happens when that doesn't work so well? You've probably heard there's a lot of talk now about leaky gut and how inflammation is the source of all illness. And it is reported to be that 90% of all illness can be traced back to inflammation. So where does that inflammation come from? So what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So when we go back and we look at the digestive tract, when everything is working really well, our body is able to, the bacteria in our body is able to work with whatever it gets presented with. The bacteria, the viruses, the food, the gluten, the pesticides, all those things. And it's able to work through those things. ditch the things that we don't need, and use and put into the body the things that we do. But what happens in the case of leaky gut is a little bit like having a stream. If you go back again to the digestive tract, here's our stream, and it's a great stream, and it's got walls in that stream. Well, what happens if there are some holes put into the walls? That's when we get a leaky gut. And how does that happen? What happens is the bacteria in our body is not all of it's always good, and not all of it's always bad. But when we have things like bacteria and toxins, antibiotics, gluten, stress and anxiety, too much sugar, various lifestyle choices, in fact, look, everything. Our bodies are a receptacle for everything that we think, that we breathe, that we touch, that we eat. And when it's healthy, as I said, it's great. But when it's not healthy, it causes inflammation. And the lining of our gut actually gets, as I said, those holes punctured in. And those holes let through the toxins and the poisons. And where do they go is into our blood system. And what they do then is they cross the blood-brain barrier. And that just seeps in. As we're all connected. If we go back again to this diagram, even though this is sitting quite happily in the middle, it actually is part of this entire system. And that's exactly the same. And that's why when you have a leaky gut, that goes also into our system, which causes inflammation, which causes an immune response, which has our body going, oh my gosh, there's trouble, there's inflammation down there, let's go deal with that. So then that sort of leads us a little bit towards how does it actually make us unwell, having a leaky gut. It's reported having a leaky gut, or this inflammation, this having the gut that's the bacteria that's not doing the job that it's able to do and pushing everything into our systems, reported to cause, to be responsible for depression and stress and constipation, diarrhea, IBS, migraines, insomnia, headaches, colds, food sensitivities, a plethora of things. But how is that possible? How is it possible that we would even know that that's happening? Because it happens over a long period of time, chronic inflammation. So I want to share a story with you. So some researchers have been thinking a little bit about the poop story and wanted to share the story of two mice. So researchers take two mice, germ-free mice, both delivered by cesarean section, no illnesses, that obviously, because they're germ-free, and they introduce the gut bacteria of a fat person and the gut bacteria of a thin person, and we end up with, they feed exactly the same diet. The mouse that's fed the lean bacteria stays lean, and the fat bacteria makes the mouse fat. How does that actually work? Have you ever there's diets galore, and in some ways I think this probably sort of punctures a hole in the whole, you are what you eat. I think it's much more likely to be you are what you digest and absorb, because in this case the mice are exactly the same, and yet because of their gut flora, one processes food in a very different way to the other. Exactly the same food. And I know that you will have met people who, members of the same family, who all eat the same thing, do the same thing, yet some are thin and some aren't. So what they also did was they took samples of the mice's poop just to see what was going on there. And they actually found that the fat mouse his body had literally taken all the goodness, all the nutrients, all of everything out of the poop, and the poop was literally devoid of nutrients, whereas the lean mouse had only taken what he needed. So there's a suggestion here in building the picture that the gut microbes, or the bacteria in the body, was able to break down these things more efficiently. I also wanted to sort of bring in the concept of whether or not the alteration in our gut bacteria and it feeding through and creating inflammation has any impact on anxiety and stress. So there was another, because I mentioned that earlier, I mentioned how it goes through the blood-brain barrier and is carried through the vagus nerve. So whatever happens in the head and the gut, it's, instead of it being like a radio where one sends a message to the other, they're actually sending messages to each other at the same time. And so here's a thought a little bit about which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Which comes first? Are you stress first and then that impacts your gut, or is your gut stressed and that causes you stress? So they took it again, some germ-free mice, and they put in the bugs of a very stressed person. And what they found was the mouse got stressed. So there are some ways of thinking about this. It's like, is it all in our gut? Well, how do we get stressed in the first place? How do our gut bacteria get stressed? So that's one of the things we're going to look at now. What busts the gut? What damages our bacteria? Antibiotics, the pill, and acids, chemos, steroids, really basically any drugs. Environment, pesticides, herbicides, dirty water, processed food, meat, sugar, gluten, alcohol, artificial sweetness, smoking. And I think also that if you have any food sensitivities, although again it's another case of which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Do you have the food sensitivities, and then that causes an alteration in your gut flora, which then causes the inflammation, which then causes that to seep into your body and then causes an allergy? Or is it the other way around? It's a little bit difficult for me anyway to make that conclusion. Stress, vaccines and viruses. So those are some of the things that right now are impacting everybody's gut flora. But how does it impact us on a day-to-day basis? Because quite a lot of what goes on inside our body we're not privy to. We might have, chronic inflammation, but we may not see any obvious signs of it. We might not have cancer or diabetes or autism or any of those things. So some of the signs of those things that might be familiar to you are, and I know because we had a chat about this before we started, diarrhea, constipation, bloating, farting, bad breath, allergies and food sensitivities, anxiety, stress, depression, headaches, feeling tired and not feeling that you have any energy, brittle nails, acne, skin rashes are just a few of the signs that something might not be right in your gut. So what helps us in our gut? So earlier we looked at babies and we looked at the fact that when they're born they get these fantastic bacteria from the mother's birth canal and then from the body and then from breastfeeding. So breastfeeding is one of the first prebiotics that we are exposed to. But we're talking about eating real food, and at the moment there's a thought that a Mediterranean diet would be a really good thing for people to adopt. Lots of leafy greens, olive oils, healthy meats, grass-fed things. But in my mind, I think eat real food. If you can't plant it, or it's not walking past your house in a field, don't eat it. Natural births, and grab those bugs. So if you can't have a natural birth and you have to have a cesarean, consciously think about how could you transfer. I say that because of the audience that there is tonight. How could you take those bugs that you have and share them with your baby? I'm not quite sure how to do that, but it has been done, and I can send you a link to that. Get moving. One of the things that circulates our blood and circulates our oxygen is aerobic exercise, and that's really important. Good 20 minutes a day. Pre and probiotics and fermented foods. So when we have prebiotic food like fermented food that goes through our body, we have lactobacillus in our body, and that creates a probiotic which is actually very soothing for our bacteria and helpful to it. Helps build a good community of healthy bacteria. Get good sleep. It's really important to get good sleep. And also that recently it was shown in a study that our bacteria actually have a circadian rhythm. So if we don't get enough sleep, they don't get to sleep too. So that's quite interesting. Adequate vitamin D3 and K2, those two things work together, a bit like black pepper and curcumin. You have those two together and they're absorbed better into the body. Or some sun and some vitamin B12. I'm not saying go and bask out in the sun for 24 hours a day, but get some exposure to the sun. 10 minutes till you're a little bit pink is good. Vitamin B12, often, if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, vitamin B12 is probably something you really should consider taking. Clean water, really important. And when I say clean water, I'm not talking about don't take it from the spring or the well. I'm talking about water that hasn't got lots of what the water that comes out of your tap has. So think about, are you having water out of plastic bottles? If you're having water out of plastic bottles, change it to glass or to stainless steel, and try to, if you can't have clean water, have filtered water. And get a little dirty. Go barefoot and say no to antibacterial soap. So some of the thoughts are that we're actually too clean. And I know you've probably had or experienced a sort of dilly belly. You've gone to another place or another country and you've got dilly belly and you've got a bit of diarrhea going on there. And that's because our bacteria that we have in our little family in our body, in our gut, is not used to bacteria in a different environment, and so the only way it knows how to deal with that is to respond that way in our body. So it's letting us know that we've taken in some bacteria that we're not used to. But is that it? So now we're building a picture of, if the gut bacteria is responsible for 90% of all disease that we have, that it's responsible for many of the things that I mentioned, where do genes fit into that? What's the role of our genetics? There also has to be, which is first. It seems to be that they're actually interconnected, a bit like the two-way transistor radio. If you have a good diet, then your gut bacteria is going to be a little bit healthier, and then that in turn is going to, dictate whether or not we get a leaky gut and whether what passes through and into our blood systems. But if our gut bacteria is really, really bad and it's not digesting or absorbing our food, even though it's really good, then what goes through and what passes on. So I think it's really a combination of things, and it's actually, I think this is just the beginning. My feeling is, maybe we're going to end up with poop diet pills and people are going to be using, they are already using fecal transplants to help people be well with certain conditions, and that's a wonderful thing, but it also suggests that our gut bacteria does really play a very vital role in our health. But it is again a case of which comes first, the chicken or the egg, and I don't know that that we can actually determine that. And I think it's really important that we look at it as holistically as we can, and that everything that we think, that we eat, that we drink, that we put on our skin goes into our bodies and is processed. Our gut bacteria process that, and then depending on how healthy that is and how much it digests and absorbs, that is then dependent on how much goes into our body that is not great, and then we have low-lying chronic inflammation. So I leave that with you, with your thoughts that there's going to be more on this. I think it's going to explode actually. So keep your own gut healthy by adopting some of those practices, eating a really good diet. Thanks for your time.